Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome students to another lecture of Political Leadership and Communication. We are heading towards almost the end of this course. This particularly lecture is about the issues and the challenges generally we have during political communication and leadership. We also have discussed earlier that how to improve our communicative skills, how to improve our leadership skills, what all particularly should be imbibed in us, or how can we basically improve our communication in terms of changing the attitudes of the voters, or how do we influence the voter behavior. Now all this particularly happens not just through one particular single skill, but it's a culmination of lot of skills we imbibed over the period of time. Generally, we should keep a lot of things in mind before we are actually when we say give a speech in front of the audience, or when we are a leader of an organization, or when we are even a manager of any particular organization. Though I have clearly specified that there's a difference between a leader and a manager, but when we talk about particularly communicative skills in a leader also, what differs is your vision, your strength to take risks, your strength to take brought about a change, and also that how you bring about this change, what all skills you basically imbibe in you to change the course of action. Okay. Now, since this lecture is about the challenges of political communication and leadership, so we'll mostly be focusing on the political aspect of it. We've also, studied till now that these skills of communication or leadership, whether they are, decision-making skills, or know your audience, or, how you should be open to adaptability and constructive feedback, how you should basically have an empathetic attitude, which is your emotional intelligence, how all these basically say skills improve your communication skills or leadership styles is very, very important. And please do not get confused when I talk about what are the theories of leadership and what is the skills of leadership, because skills is something very different from theories. Theories is basically what people have analyzed and evolved over the period of time, but skills is something which you basically imbibe in you, and there is not just a skill which probably you can learn from a lecture or a theoretical method. There are also skills which you basically learn out of experience, or somebody whom you basically admire, certain kind of skills you also imbibe. So even though I am trying to cover most of the skills and whether it is leadership or communicative skills, but it is important that apart from this also you have a certain kind of receptiveness about the new skills which you can imbibe. Okay, because with the upcoming time of digitalization, we basically see that certain kind of new skills come up every day, whether it is the AI which has recently come up, how you use this AI in terms of development of your skills is very, very important. Okay, and these days you have very basic tutorials also to incorporate. So even though I am going to educate you on today on the challenges particularly about communicative skills which you should keep in mind. Now this is very, very important because sometimes what happens is that knowing or unknowingly we tend to basically commit certain kind of issues which basically lead to people judging us in a wrong way, or people are not able to understand us, or there are certain kind of issues where it leads to certain kind of unequal situations or conflict for that matter. Okay, now we've always seen that in contemporary times, since our the time span of our attention is decreasing, and we require something new coming up every time. We require something which is very catchy. Okay, now all this because of the new era of digitalization, and also we've come across during all these phases about how communication has been happening over the years. We basically tend to ignore certain kind of challenges which are there, and we should keep in mind whenever we are communicating as a political leader, as a leader of an organization, as a teacher of lot of students, as a principal, or any job which requires you to take credibility, which requires you to take responsibility, accountability. All these particular areas you would require to keep certain things in mind before you basically communicate yourself with the fellow beings. Okay, so today's class is about the issues and challenges, and we'll see what things you should basically keep in mind before this communication process starts even. Okay, to start with, this is basically contemporary challenges and issues in political communication and leadership. It is basically that since there is a rapid transformation in 21st century, as I've told you, it has influenced by technological advancement, social fragmentation, evolving expectations of democratic governance. All these particularly have led to political leaders strive to connect with the diverse and digitally networked populations. They confront with new challenges in conveying their messages effectively, maintaining credibility and leading to complexities. Okay, now we all know that this social fragmentation, whether it is polarization, now in today's world we see that there's a lot of polarization happening. When I talk about polarization is basically people are going in different directions, and there is a very strict compartmentalization happening here, in the sense that the boundaries are so strict that if you have or you're endorsing any particular ideology, you do not just want to listen to the other side, or you do not want to incorporate a new belief system within your own life. That is because through your digitalization, these particularly what internet has done is that they tends to create echo chambers where your belief systems are basically validated by the media through showing you of the similar content. For example, if you search something on Facebook, you will generally, or something on Google, you will generally get news associated with that particular event continuously. So what is that? That is basically creating echo chambers where your belief system is basically validated by the internet again and again, and then you tend to create a certain kind of ideological drive in your mind about certain things, and which is very difficult to change because that has been validated constantly in your mind again and again. Okay, so then it is important that while you basically try all these skills to incorporate, these challenges should be kept in mind, especially this 21st century contemporary challenges. Okay, so let's see what they are. The key contemporary issues facing political communication and leadership include disinformation and misinformation. Now, this is very, very common in today's world. We all see that, you have fake news, you have fake messages, you have fake videos coming up, people with, especially media comes up and it gets circulated on the WhatsApp so quickly and so easily that, people tend to believe. Okay, sometimes your media also, in order to gain TRP, tries to focus on areas where it is not giving you the correct information, or even if it's giving you the correct information, it gives you in such a way that that information is interpreted in a different way. Okay, so then it becomes very, very important that how you differentiate between misinformation or disinformation. It should be always done that where your what is the source of your news or a message. Okay, if that source is a credible source, then you basically should trust that, and not particularly any random message which you get on WhatsApp groups or Facebook, because then that source might not be credible enough. Okay, the next is media polarization. Now, media polarization is nothing but how media tends to, divide the society on the basis of certain kind of belief system, on the basis of certain kind of ideology, and how particularly it's validated again and again through showing you of certain kind of news or showing you certain kind of ads, how political advertisement happens. One particular event is politically advertised in such a manner that it basically shows a belief system, whether it is in support of a political party or whether it is in support of opposition, or whether how media wants to basically want you to view it as. Okay, so it might not tell you what to think, but it will definitely tell you how to think about it. Okay, so that is polarization happening through particularly framing, media framing. Okay, and how they use the agendas, how they use algorithms to basically create these echo chambers. Okay, the next is your trust erosion. Okay, now what is this trust erosion? For example, if you have any event and you know that the government probably mishandled it. Okay, say during the second wave of COVID-19, government mishandled it, and lot of things were allowed, people were allowed to go out, there was deliveries allowed which was not there in the first phase, and that is why you saw that the death which happened in the second phase was enormous as compared to the first one. So then you think that the government was not able to handle the situation properly, and that is why a certain kind of trust was eroded. So till the time you are not able to handle things properly, or you're not able to give information correctly, then particularly your credibility will be challenged, and eventually that trust will be eroded. Okay, the next is crisis management. Okay, it's basically how you behave during a crisis. Okay, this is very, very important, that whenever you see that even in small organizations, for example Microsoft, if we take these business organizations, if that CEO of that company is not able to make that company reach its height, or if that company is going in losses, then the first person to be you will be blaming is the CEO. Okay, so then what happens is, during the crisis, whether there is inflation, whether there is famine, or whether there is a natural calamity like COVID-19. Okay, all these particularly crisis situation, how your political leaders, for example, view that situation and handle that situation, or what effect they can bring about in the society in that situation, is very important, because that will determine the course of action. For example, we know that previous governments are basically following this appeasement policy when it comes to whether it was terrorism, whether it comes to whether it was taking sides during your Cold War situation. Okay, now we know that during Cold War, Nehru particularly adopted something called NAM, non-alignment. Okay, that we will not align to any particular sides. Okay, at that time it was necessary. Why? Because we were not in a position particularly to take sides, because we could not support any country military. Okay, because we had just got independence. Okay, so at that time the requirement of that hour was that we did not take sides. Okay, but probably afterwards also we saw that the certain kind of wars which happened, whether it's 61, 62, 71, we saw that the appeasement was followed. We were not very strict or cruel in our motives. Okay, but now what has happened, there's a drastic shift where we see that the government is a very strong government and tries to take you can say action immediately if some kind of terrorist act happen, or if some kind of say crisis situation happens in terms of national security. So then it is very, very important particularly that how a leader or how a manager of a company or CEO of a company reacts to certain kind of crisis at that time. Okay, youth engagement. Okay, and next the last one is identity politics. Now youth engagement is basically because of the digitalization, and we have already seen that how people should or the leaders should adapt to this digitalization over the period of time. How they should do it is basically through youth participation as well. Why? Because youth is regarded as the change makers. Okay, they can bring about change. Why? Because they're coming up with new ideas constantly. And if you even able to do that, then we see that there is a certain kind of rigor in the society. The morale is built. Why? Because it is led by youth. There has been a change. Earlier used to happen that the more the senior leaders was in the political party, people used to trust that political party, okay, because they were coming out of experience. But now what has happened, that there's a change. Now people, what they want to see is, they want to see a youth led party, okay, where there is rigor, where there are new ideas coming up, okay. So that is why you constantly see even our PM talking about how the youth is important for our country, how they can bring about a social change. Why? Because that's the need for an hour, okay. The last is identity politics. Now this is very important, and this has been playing role in political system since the advent of political parties, particularly in India. Why? Because we all know that we were a caste discriminated society, and we all know that how particularly different people belonging from different caste have built their positions in the political sphere. When we had the Congress coming up after independence, we know that it was an umbrella party, and it basically incorporated most of the ideologies of different parties, whether it was socialism, whether it was communism, or whether it was liberalism or Gandhianism, okay. All these kind of ideologies were seen in particularly the INC, that is Indian National Congress. Why? Because the leaders at that time were national freedom fighters, and they had certain kind of trust with the people, and the people had trust in them. But over the period of time, we see the new parties coming up, whether it's Communist Party, whether it's Socialist Party, okay. And then we also see that parties based on Dalit identity also coming up, whether it is Bahujan Samaj Party, okay, coming up. So then we see that how other communities were basically trying to establish their own identity in the political parties, particularly in order to have certain kind of change being brought about, okay. So this all issues which are there, the identity issue, okay, how do the political parties tackle this is very important. Then you had the Aam Aadmi Party coming recently, which was basically a party which came for like an anti-corruption movement in order to basically clean the corruption. So that was not something which had identity in caste, but it had identity of lot of people who wanted a corruption free society. So then that identity was also incorporated. So how you basically review these identities to your advantage is what we are going to study today, okay. So let's just start with the first one, which is disinformation and misinformation, okay. So one of the most pressing challenges in contemporary political communication is the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation, particularly through digital and social media platform. The rise of algorithms that prioritize engagement has facilitated the viral spread of false information, often at the expense of verified fact, okay. Now you must have seen this, that sometimes what happen is that this kind of misinformation is always being spread. Say for example, you had a misinformation that if you basically do Anulom Vilom, if you do lung exercises, then you will not catch COVID, okay. Or if you have some kind of natural or Ayurvedic medicines, you will not have COVID-19, okay. Now all this particularly instances just led us to believe that there are other ways to probably not catch COVID-19, and there are other ways to basically prevent it, and not wearing mask or washing hands, okay. Now such kind of messaging were being circulated. So now what happened is, rather than believing on verified facts by WHO that you should always wear mask, you should wash your hands, you should maintain social distancing, people tend to also focus on these more, okay. So then what happened, that this is a misinformation, and because it had spread it so quickly across the society, that we see that people tend to believe on this more than how they should be believing on the WHO organizations or the doctors for that matter. Okay, misinformation, that is false information shared without harmful intent. Okay, now there is one kind of information which does not have an harmful intent, and there is disinformation, which is basically false information shared with an intent to deceive people. Okay, which is basically undermining democratic discourse by distorting public understanding and inflaming political divisions. Okay, for example, if the political party kinds to want to create a certain kind of separatist movements. Okay, so they will constantly create the situation again and again that particularly one part of the community was constantly, say Hindu community was constantly there, they were beaten to death, they were basically killed. Why? By the other say Muslim communities. Okay, if particularly the political party wants to gain certain kind of votes, they would constantly basically show such kind of information in order to gain, say, Hindu votes. Okay, so then it is basically disinformation, where information is given on the basis of the intent that they want to cause certain kind of harm to the society, or they want it in their own favor. Okay, so that is why it is said that disinformation is false information shared with the intent to deceive the people, undermine democratic discourse by distorting public understanding and inflaming certain kind of political divisions. Okay, the advent of deep fakers, AI generated videos and audios that fabricate statements or actions exaggerates this problem by making it increasingly difficult for citizens to distinguish between authenticated and manipulative content. Okay, the next is an example of misinformation was widespread circulated of the false information during COVID-19. As I told you that misinformation was there during the second phase of COVID-19, that is from 2020 to 21, where there was misleading claims about how cow urine or gomutra and cow dung cures or protects from COVID-19. Now, this confusion undermines the trust in science-based public health messaging and potentially lead to harmful behaviors. Another example was in 2019 Lok Sabha election, where there were fake videos showed, particularly about political candidates, religion and nationality, and conspiracy theories about the electronic voting machines. Okay, now in 2019 there were a lot of fake news that that EVMs are rigged, they do not have authenticated data, the votes are basically being not calculated properly, or for that matter this particular candidate, it shows that he or she is from the Hindu religion, but he or she is not from this nationality or religion particularly. All these news were basically shown or tampered with in order to basically dissuade people from their own beliefs. Okay, so these messages were often used to polarize voters along the religious or caste lines and sow distrust in electoral process. For example, in the recent Delhi elections, we also saw that how political parties are basically trying to show that our result in government schools run by Delhi basically showed how their results were improving over the period of time. Now, there were basically reports which showed that that is not true. Okay, particularly government was basically paying the teachers to make these students cheat. Now, this kind of information when it comes, so people tend to believe, how much government has improved the education in government schools in Delhi. But what happens is that this kind of information was basically being used by the political parties to basically gain votes. But on the other hand, you had certain kind of news showing that no, that is not true. Okay, so this kind of misinformation or disinformation tends to create a certain kind of chaos in the society, and you change your views about it. So that is why the credibility, the trust which is basically built is lost, because there is a lot of misinformation and people get persuaded or guided by that. Okay. The next challenge particularly is of media fragmentation and political polarization, which is basically that in the digital era, it has led to highly fragmented media landscape where individuals often consume information within the ideological echo chambers. Social media platforms through algorithm personalize tend to reinforce users' pre-existing belief, creating an isolated communities with limited exposure to the opposing viewpoints. Okay, now this is exactly what I was explaining about echo chambers. Now, echo chambers are basically nothing but whatever belief system you have, what the the internet does is that it tends to validate it again and again, or reinforces it again and again through through ads or sites particularly. So what happens is that there's an echo chamber created here, which basically means that if you remember during 1950s or before that also, where there was no internet and people only had information from either loudspeakers or the dhols, people used to come in the community and talk about information, or particularly after 1950s where there were newspapers. Okay, so as I told you that if you're reading a Hindu newspaper, people assume that you will be a leftist. If you're reading Times of India, you will be a right wing. Okay, so similarly, the at that time media houses know that which ideological paper was promoting which ideology. Okay, so then there was an echo chamber created here, that people did not had particularly advent of what actual information is or the opposing viewpoints of it. Okay, so they were basically having the same ideological content provided to them in the form of newspapers. Now what has happened is, even though we have come up across these all phases through a new digitalization, but still because we this media through media platforms, what happens that information is based on your own belief system. So that is why when you have been validated with the same news again and again and same viewpoints again and again, then you tend not to broaden your information by listening to opposing views, and then you are isolated from it. Okay, so exactly what is this sentence saying is that digital era has led to a highly fragmented media landscape where individuals often consume information within their ideological echo chambers, and particularly the social media platforms through algorithm. Algorithm is nothing but what you search, the internet will basically take on that and give you examples or news based on that particular search you have done. Okay, it's a personalized way, tend to reinforce users pre-existing beliefs. Okay, if I believe that yes, I am a Muslim, and probably I am always, my religion is always put in threat by the Hindu nationalist, and that belief will continue to stay with me irrespective if I do not listen to other viewpoints. So that is exactly what my internet is continuously showing me, because that is the belief which have basically been created. Okay, now this phenomena contributes to the political polarization, making consensus building and democratic deliberation more difficult. Okay, so it's difficult to basically create a certain kind of solidarity in the nation, because then this polarization has already happened. Okay, it is a partisan selective exposure, fosters ideological rigidity and reduces political tolerance. Okay, this is exactly what is happening in contemporary times, where you see that there's a partisan selective exposure. Now this is exactly used to happen in the earlier phase of communication process, where your loyalty used to lie to one particular party, say Congress party, during the freedom struggle. Now also it is happening the same thing, that there's a partisan relationship where is being built, where the particularly one political party has created a certain kind of network where it's not just the party which is promoting the ideology, but the people, and these people have tend to support the party blindly without any kind of acceptance or tolerance about other views. So that is why when we talk about partisan selective exposure, it fosters an ideological rigidity, that I would only follow a certain kind of ideology and would not listen, or basically not try to incorporate in my ideological sphere other political views. Okay, so for political leaders, this fragmentation necessitates a strategic balance between addressing their core base and reaching across the aisle. Ability to bridge this divide can result in gridlock, civil unrest, and decline in public faith in democratic process. So we all know that, because if political parties continue to divide the society through polarization, because it's their vote bank, it would create much more cleavages in the society than even the caste system did. Okay, so we all know that in India the caste system led to a divide of the society. It led to deepened cleavages in the society on the basis of which caste you belong. But since this particularly caste discrimination was tried to overcome, whether through reservations, whether through providing equality to everybody, it has basically believed that over the period of time ideological difference had led to the, not just a caste division but a class ideological division in the society particularly. Okay, and this would basically lead to some kind of civil unrest as we see during the riots. Okay, where every particular class and caste is trying to have their say in the political process, and that is exactly what will happen eventually, that people will not have so much trust in the democratic process, because democracy means that each and everybody's demands should be equally heard and not some particularly because of an ideological divide, a particularly ideology should be given preference. Okay, an example of this was Citizen Amendmentship Act. Let's see. Now, we all know that the CAA, which was passed in 2019, it offered a path to Indian citizenship for non-Muslim migrants from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. Basically, the catchword of this Amendment Act was that it was giving citizenship to all those who were non-Muslims, okay, and only these countries were included, which is Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. Now, critics of this act argued that it is basically demeaning the secular principles of the constitution, and it led to a certain kind of protest across India in terms of there was a discrimination being done to the Muslims. And the second issue with CAA was the NRC, that is the National Register maintenance, which had to be implemented in Assam areas or the Bengal areas in order to differentiate between people who are the citizens of India or who are the refugees in India. Okay. Also, particularly how this event was basically being framed according to their own benefit is how we are going to see that how media framing and political polarization actually happens. Okay, so pro-government media outlets, whether it was TV, journalists, whether it was Republic TV, Z News or Times Now, they largely supported the government narrative portraying protesters as anti-national, influenced by foreign powers or as a threat to political order. So here, basically the CA was trying to, be pro-government in terms that, it is very essential to get this Amendment Act, and all those who are opposing are either anti-nationals or basically they are not concerned about the security of the country. Okay. Independent and critical media, particularly the Wire or the Scroll or NDTV, highlights issues of police brutality, constitutional concerns and the voices of peaceful protesters participating, especially the Muslim women. Okay. Now, another media framing was done as to how people were basically fighting for their democratic rights. Okay. So, this particular event was framed by media in two different frames. One was basically trying to frame it in terms of, how government's narrative is basically being protested by anti-nationals, and second narrative was how people are fighting for their democratic rights, and this kind of discrimination should not be there. And next frame is basically with this event is how political polarization happened during this event. So the issue deeply polarized public opinion and ideological and religious lines. Supporters of BJP viewed CAA as humanitarian measure and accused the opposition of fear mongering. Okay. This issue deeply was polarized because it created to a division in the society in terms of public opinion, both on ideological and religious lines. Okay, so supporters of BJP or the CAA was basically seeing it as a kind of an humanitarian intervention. Why? Because according to them, they said that all these non-Muslims who are staying in these countries are basically being tortured or being in living in an undignified way in these countries. Why? Because these are all Muslim dominated countries. So that is why it's a humanitarian effort in order to bring them back and provide them a dignified life. So this was represented by the BJP government as a humanitarian particularly action, okay. Whereas the opponents of it, including civil society, students and minority, saw it as a step towards institutionalized religious discrimination. So for them, it was not a humanitarian effort, it was basically leading to discrimination, particularly to a one particular section, which were the Muslims, okay. So why not the Muslims also should be given citizenship, okay. So that is why it was basically, the opponent said that it is against the Constitution of India, because the Constitution of India promotes secularism, okay. The polarization was reflected in political discourse as BJP leaders used slogans like "Desh ke gaddaron ko goli maro" or "Shoot the traitors of the nation," further inflaming these divisions, okay. Opposition parties like Congress, AAP and various regional parties accused the government of undermining secularism, as I told you, okay. So that is why one, you saw how media framed a particular event in two different ways, and secondly you saw how political polarization happened during this event, okay. So this is an example of how media framing and political polarization is a challenge and should be kept in mind when you are basically trying to enhance your skill of communication and also trying to appease the voters or change the voting behavior of people. Okay, the second challenge here is erosion of trust in political leadership. Now, public trust in political leadership has been declining globally, driven by perceptions of corruption, lack of transparency and inefficiency. Scandals broken, promises broken and elitist conduct have alienated many citizens from the elective representatives. In many democracies, this has led to the rise of populist leaders who frame themselves as outsiders, challenging a discredited establishment, okay. Trust, as Fukuyama, he is one of a very famous scholar, notes, is a foundational element of social capital and effective governance. Without it, political communication becomes transactional and adversarial rather than deliberative and constructive. Leaders must therefore prioritize authenticity, accountability and ethical conduct to rebuild public confidence and foster engagement, okay. Now, let's just take an example of how this, particularly when we say that elitist conducts have alienated many citizens, okay. Now, if you remember that during national freedom struggle, INC generally had members from an elite society, elite as in that they were educationally also very advanced, and also they had money particularly, so they belonged to an elite class at that time. So there was this criticism that because these all members in the INC are belonging from an elite class, it is very difficult for the normal public to connect with them, okay, one. But how this particularly narrative changed, this narrative changed with advent of Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian national struggle. Even though he also belonged to a very prosperous family, but the way he conducted himself, the way he basically related with the mass population, the kind of clothes he used to wear, the kind of actions he used to take, was basically led him to basically associate with the lower part of the society as well, okay, the mass population particularly. So then it is said that this erosion of trust in political leadership happens, one, when your credibility is challenged, two, when you try to portray yourself as very elite and not from particularly the mass population. So then what happens is, as Francis Fukuyama says, that it is a foundational element. This trust is a foundational element of social capital and effective governance. So this trust is very, very important because it leads to authenticity and accountability. Let's see an example of how this trust was broken, okay. COVID-19 second wave, April and in June particularly. Now, during this phase, it was basically, we had this preconceived notions, our leaders had these preconceived notions that since the first wave we were able to tackle quite well, this second wave will also be able to tackle. But what happened is that during this second wave, there were political rallies, especially during West Bengal elections, they were allowed. Religious gathering in Kumbh Mela was also allowed, okay, COVID protocols were not followed, and that is why this second wave hit us hard. And because India's healthcare was not prepared for this, so we had shortages of oxygen cylinders, hospital beds, okay, there was mass criminations which was happening, and there was of course widespread suffering. So what happened during this event? There was an erosion of trust. There was an erosion of trust by the people in the government, okay. So because government was not prepared, this trust the erosion of trust happened. There was misinformation and mixed messaging, which is basically prioritizing politics over public welfare, which is that because there was Bengal elections come up, and BJP was basically fighting against Mamata Banerjee, Trinamool Congress, and that is why politics was given more importance rather than public health care, and all these rallies were allowed in Bengal. What happened? So then people tend to have this mistrust in the government, that for them politics is more important than particularly the health care, okay. Opacity and denial. Now there was also a mistrust. Why? Because what news was showing and what the data was showing was not very credible enough. Why? Because there were deaths which were unreported. The actual amount of death rate which happened and what was being shown on the media platform were very different. Why? Because the civil society knew what was happening with them, and that is why there was a lot of mistrust, because the credibility was challenged here. The data which was provided was challenged here, okay. So there was no opacity, there was no transparency in the events which were happening. So this was discouraging. Why? Because the data collection was not appropriate, okay. The last thing which happened was the public sentiment. So now the impact of all this was that the citizens turned to community for help rather than for the government, and that is why you have hashtags like resign Modi and where is the government trending globally, okay. So this impact happened. Why? Because people lost trust in the government due to their belief that government was prioritizing politics over public welfare, okay. So next challenge which we should keep in mind is the crisis communication and leadership. Now in the 21st century has witnessed a series of global crises like pandemics, climate emergencies or climate change, geopolitical conflicts. Now how does the leader react in these circumstances, and what is demanded at that time, how effective the leader is, how empathetic the political communication is very, very important whenever it's a crisis communication. This empathy might not be needed when you are defining any policy or educating people about any policy, but this is definitely important when it has to do with crisis situations like climate change, like air pollution which happens during the winter phase in northern states, okay, due to the burning of parali, what we call. So in certain circumstances, how does the government is able to cure this, okay. Like for example, in Delhi particularly, there was a lot of criticism that this time the government was not able to tackle this pollution, even though it happens every year. They were not very well prepared, okay. So that is why when you're not able to tackle any particular crisis situation effectively, then you see that this trust and credibility is lost in the government. And you should keep in mind that your true communication and leadership skills are tested during this crisis communication, okay. So crisis communication requires leaders to convey information that is timely, accurate and emotionally resonant, okay. COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, highlighted a stark differences in leadership styles and communication effectively across countries. Now let's just take another example of another leader during COVID-19, which is Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, who were basically, she was widely praised for combating COVID-19, because what action was taken here, that there was combination of transparency and compassion, okay. So again, there was transparency in talking about the news, in talking about the events, in providing the data to the people. At the same time, there was empathy. The compassion here was basically being also ensured by fostering public compliance and trust, okay. In contrast, inconsistent messaging and politicization of crisis have led to confusion and resistance in other contexts, okay. As we just discussed with the second wave, what happened in India, that politics was given much more importance importance than public welfare, and there was no transparency in the data or the the deaths what happened, or the how the healthcare was basically not appropriate at that time. So basically depends on how a leader reacts in this crisis communication. Okay, another very good example we all know could be of Bhopal gas tragedy. We all know that it happened in 1984, and it is regarded as one of the crucial or critical tragedies which happened during 1984. It led to actually repercussions not at that time but also for the upcoming years. And this phase is regarded as a very black phase. Why? Because this particular tragedy could have tackled very in a much effective and a better way, but it did not happen. So what happened during this particularly Bhopal gas leak was that there was a plant called Union Carbide in India, and it was a pesticide plant in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, which released a toxic gas called methyl isocyanate, affecting hundreds and thousands of people. The estimates of death toll were around 3,000 immediately, but it was basically suggested later on that more than 20,000 people must have died, because this particular gas affected people not at just that time, but for the upcoming generations as well. So over 500,000 people were exposed to this toxic gas, and the long term effects had led to a chronic health issues in the affected population. Okay, so certain issues like this particularly, now how did the government react at this time, particularly during the Bhopal gas tragedy, is very important, because this was a very crucial time. Okay, so crisis communication and leadership, how it should be done. Initially the response and the communication, there was a failure. Okay, so now how the leader should have actually reacted during this time, it was not done. There was a communication failure. Why was there communication failure? Because there was a delayed response, that how harmful this gas can be. Okay, you've all seen lot of movies being made on this, that people were not informed that how harmful this gas can be, and that is why they did not take it so seriously, and evacuation which should have happened immediately was delayed in a process. The government was not very active in terms of basically evacuating people. Okay, so the first failure in crisis communication was that it was a delayed response. So first thing you have to keep in mind, that your response should be quick. Okay, from Union Carbide and local authorities. Union Carbide's plant management failed to immediately alert the local population. Okay, and evacuation could not happen. In early hours following the leak, officials made conflicting statements. Now, basically, we do not know how harmful the gas is, because we all are not chemical engineers. Okay, but what happened, that the particularly people who were working there should have got in and given information on various media platforms or through radio, how people should basically tackle with it and how they should basically evacuate immediately. There were basically mixed responses. Okay, the local government led by the Chief Minister of Madhya Pradesh failed to coordinate an immediate evacuation, and confusion about the cause of this disaster created a panic. The cause were taken initially very differently, that no, this is not the plant, this is their climate change, and this is not particularly so harmful. But all these, misinformation which was being carried, it led to a death of lot of people. Okay, so government's crisis management, the Indian government's response was marked by a series of missteps. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi initially downplayed the scale of tragedy. Nobody thought that it would lead to such, humongous cry among people and deaths what happened at that time. Okay, so Indira Gandhi's initially downplayed the scale of tragedy, offering a relatively low death toll. Like, what was being reported was basically not exact actual data, and vague statements about the government's response. Okay. Second, despite widespread reports of casualty, the central and state governments took time to react, and miscommunication about the extent of the communication delayed the relief efforts. Okay. Now, exactly if this particular crisis and the, how this could have been tackled, the response of it would have been taken earlier, then to some extent the death rate could have been reduced, because the kind of, say, even if somebody was affected by it, what was the response, okay, what medicine should be given. If people were basically even told that, you should take this medicine. For example, during COVID-19, whenever people were getting injected with the vaccine, they were told that, you have to take certain kind of, say, Dolo 600, or, you have to take paracetamol that was being given. If at that time the hospitals were basically equipped with certain kind of, say, medicines, or the reaction of the government could have been quick, we could have saved lot of lives. So it basically depends how you tackle the situation, and you are basically judged on those bases. Okay. Now, the next particularly in this event was the corporate response and leadership. Okay. Now, the leadership of the Union Carbide was heavily criticized for its poor crisis communication. The CEO of this particular, factory was arrested, but then he left the country. So, again, this led to believe in people that the government could do nothing because of the, the traitor, and he was not even punished for it. Okay. So the company failed to provide timely information about the nature of gas leak and its effects. In the following days, Union Carbide issued vague statements claiming the situation was under control and that there could be no long-term environment impact, which later was proven untrue. Okay. As I told you that the impact just ended at that time, it led towards generations, because the children who were born at that time was also being suffered because of this gas. Okay. So Union Carbide also initially downplayed the health impact of the gas exposure. Okay. Post crisis communication and legal failures, what happened is that aftermath of this communication, there was lack of transparency within the Indian government and the Union Carbide, failing to provide adequate compensation. One. Secondly, a major failure of leadership was slow judicial process. Okay. The judiciary did not particularly take into account or was not active enough. The company eventually paid a settlement of 470 million in 1989, but this was seen as an inefficient amount by many survivors. Okay. There was government's lack of accountability. So what exactly we learn from this particular event is that this event of Bhopal gas tragedy was basically an example of how crisis communication failures lead to basically a greater harm, and if you do not act in time and there is no transparent communication both from the government and the corporate, then it would basically lead to establishing this belief system that this government is ineffective. Okay. There was further lack of responsibility, there was lack of accountability, and basically preparedness. So again, I'm saying that this is one of the challenge, that how a leader should basically act during the crisis situation. Okay. It is very, very important. The next is youth engagement and digital activism. Now, this is very important. Why? Because as I have told you that earlier, people used to trust the senior members. Why? Because they thought that it is out of experience. Now, what people want, the voters want, is that youth should be a part of the political parties and their campaigns, because they are basically coming up with new ideas, new rigor is there in the political parties. So, what political parties do these days is basically they try to also incorporate the youth, whether they are the influencers, whether they are basically some kind of activists, and also, or if they are new political leaders. Okay. So the emergence of digitally naive generations have reshaped the political participation. Youth today are more likely to engage through online platforms and social media campaigns and issue-based activism rather than the traditional political parties or electoral processes. Okay. Now, political communication must therefore adapt to these new modes of engagements. Leaders who fail to connect with youth, often through relative channels and language, risk alienating a significant segment of electorate. Okay. Moreover, meaningful engagement requires not just outreach but inclusion. So it's not just that you reach the youth through your communication or digitalization, but also you include them in particularly the decision making. Okay. Now this particularly challenge, or how we can foster up communication skill, can be seen through an example. where we have digital engagement in Narendra Modi's government, where there was this hashtag called Self for the Society campaign used by COVID media to spread message of solidarity and collective action during COVID-19 pandemic. Okay, so then it is basically said that how you're using the digitalization. Okay, similarly, digitalization was used during Trump's 2016 presidential election, where there was micro targeting techniques, which is basically, people, whether it is the working class voters, whether it were the white, America, were being targeted in terms to influence them directly and personally through messaging. Okay, so social media platforms are basically trying to do this, and Donald Trump generally uses Twitter, as we know, to make spontaneous announcements and attacks its opponents and frame narratives on his own on Twitter. He does not do it through social media platforms or through journalists or media people. It is basically Trump's Twitter feed became a central part of his campaign communication, creating a direct engagement with both supporters and the critics. Okay, so next is adapting to this new styles of communication. Now, what is this? This is basically youth activism. If you see that there were Fridays for Future, which was basically, you have a young climate activist, you must have heard her name also, which is Greta Thunberg, who comes to the platform and talks about how the contemporary people or the elders of the society should think what will happen to the youth if this continuous climate degradation continues to happen. Okay, so many global leaders, including your Macron, who is the French president, have responded to her call for urgent climate action. Okay, there was when she gave particularly a speech, there were a lot of leaders who connected with her, and they tried to bring the climate solution in a more spontaneous manner, which had taken a backseat. So again, climate change had come to the front. Okay, second is amplifying youth participation in decision making. It's not just that you tend to support the youth, but also tend to incorporate them in your decision making. For example, Justin Trudeau, who is the Prime Minister of Canada, established a Canadian Youth Advisory Council to give young people a voice in the national policy. Another very important example is of Malala Yousafzai. Now, she was basically shot in the head in the Pakistan, particularly by militants, because she was going for her education, she was going for school. So now particularly this, that girls in terms of education have not been given so much importance. So then it is very important that these particular females who have been encouraging people to go to schools. Okay, so one of these cases was Malala Yousafzai, and because of her courage, she was basically promoted by a lot of leaders, whether it was the Prime Minister of UK or US or France. They were basically promoting how education of girls is important. So youth was very important. Okay, the next challenge is identity politics and representation. Now, this is basically saying that how the leader should not use identity politics for their own beneficiation, and representation in the sense that representation should be done in an actual real sense, and not just as a token that you are basically probably making somebody the Prime Minister who is from the Dalit community, but you are not exactly doing anything for that community. So that is tokenism. Okay, that should not be there. Okay, so let's see what do we mean by identity politics and representation. Balancing representation versus tokenism. So representation of various identity groups in political campaign is important for fostering inclusivity. Everybody should be inclusive. As I told you, if you're making a politician, if you're making particular leader from a Dalit community, it is not about just he is given a position, but the effort he makes to improve or the genuine addresses he makes to the needs of particularly that community. Okay, representation and fragmented political discourse. In countries like India and US, political leaders use religion and ethnic group as the basis of political strategy. As I told you that, there is a fragmentation in terms of identity politics where they use religion and ethnicity for their own advantages. That should not be there, okay? Intersectionality and complexity of representation, okay? Modern societies recognize intersectionalities. That is basically identities is not about men and women on the basis of color, on the basis of class where you belong. It is about sexuality also, it is about race also, it is about gender also, okay? All these things are very, very important. So political communication struggles to address these multiple overlapping identities, which should basically be addressed. If you basically, the message cannot be too simplistic or fail to capture a diversity of the experience within each identity groups. For example, feminist movements in politics must covered with the fact that it is not about feminist movement, the needs of the women of the society is equal. Probably there is much more degradation of women who are belonging from the Dalit community to the degradation of women probably in the Western countries, okay? So there has to be a division in terms of the needs, okay? You cannot, it's not one size fits all kind of a methodology will not work, okay? A very important example is 2019 election campaign, where particularly, BJP has led to this Hindu identity politics coming in regard with gaining votes. This is just for you to read particularly how BJP as a political party has tried to gather votes on the basis of Hindu politics or Hindu nationalism, particularly whether it is building of Ram Mandir or whether it is abrogation of Article 370, whether it is talking about the role of caste it has played, where it has tried to show Ambedkar as their icon in order to gain votes of the Dalit communities, or the policies which they have basically enforced for, say, Pradhan Mantri Jan Dhan Yojana, okay? There is again, you have Kisan Samman Nidhi Yojana, which is for the farmers support. Now, all these have been used in terms of particularly identity politics, okay? The last is political polarization, which happens on identity politics and on religious grounds, is basically trying to mobilize or, trying to polarize the society, or whether it is on religious basis or whether it is on caste basis. Now, this has created a certain, kind of division, okay? And this is not just by Modi government, it is done by most of these political parties, whether it is Mamata Banerjee, whether it is Rahul Gandhi of Congress. So, that is why this identity politics plays a very crucial role, and it is important that we should able to overcome this, okay? So, contemporary political communication and leadership are confronted by an array of complex challenges that require adaptability, ethical and inclusive approaches. Disinformation should basically not be there, media polarization should not be there, the trust should be basically made within the government, and of course, this politics of identity and how representation actually should happen should be kept into mind while basically overcoming these challenges, whether it is of leadership and communication, okay? So, this is basically all for today, and I hope you will be able to analyze through the examples I've given you that what are the challenges we are basically facing while promoting any particular leader or communicative skills. I think by now you should be pretty clear about what are these challenges all about, and I think that is for today. So, thank you.